What is up, guys, and welcome to another episode of Guarani Vision, the first ever podcast dedicated to Paraguayan football in English. As always, I'm Roberto Rojas, and joining me are my two great co-hosts, Federico Perez and Ralph Hanna. And guys, coming off the bat of our interview with Andy Naylor speaking about Julio Enciso of Brighton and Hove Albion, today we'll be focusing on Braian Ojeda of Nottingham Forest. And I'm delighted to have on the show here Mr. Paul Taylor from The Athletic, correspondent for Nottingham Forest for The Athletic, to talk about what's been going on with them, what's been going on in their return to the Premier League for the first time in over 2 decades, and talk a little bit more about how the perspective of a certain Paraguayan is doing over there ahead of the season that begins next week. So let me get my co-host, Mr. Federico Perez. You know, Fede, I think there's going to be a lot of fans that are actually excited about this Nottingham Forest side because it is a big name historically. You know, this is a team that's won European Cups, has always competed in the first division back then in the Premier League in the early days. So I'm really excited to see what many people, you know, expect of this Nottingham Forest side going back into the Premier League, and especially with one Paraguayan that moved to there last year.
Yeah, obviously, just like we're doing in these 3 special episodes, just following our Paraguayan players in the Premier League, just because of how big the Premier League is. And, you know, Paraguayans here, they're really after these teams. They're really looking at all the news that are coming out of these teams. And we talked about Julio Enciso in the first episode. We're going to talk about Braian Ojeda on the second one, and I'm really looking forward to it because Braian Ojeda might be out of the 3 the one that could surprise everybody. And hey, this is a player that's been on the national team before, and the last time we saw him here in the local league, he played in a big team like Olympia. So if this guy does well, he could have a lot of fans behind him. And I want to know more about this team also. I know that there's a lot of history behind this team, and who better than Paul Taylor to tell us a lot more about this team and about everything that's happening over there in the preview of the season, another Premier League, and like never before. We have 3 Paraguayans there, so that's why we're doing this also here in Guarani Vision, Roberto.
Absolutely. And Ralph, obviously you being of English descent, obviously you have a lot of good memories of Nottingham Forest playing in this. So it definitely is a throwback to the days of you know, being a kid and seeing them perform in the Premier League or first division at the time. So I'm really interested to see how they do this season because they've done a little bit of business actually over the summer transfer window. So they might indeed surprise some people this season.
Yeah, we always see that the team that usually comes up through the playoffs ends up actually doing a bit better in the Premier League, kind of, for whatever reason that might be. Maybe they feel more of a need to improve the team, or they have a playing style that can adapt better to the Premier League. We've seen that, so that could be interesting. And of course, Nottingham Forest has an interesting place in Paraguayan history. When I first went there, I was surprised to find a few Forest fans out in Paraguay. Famously, they didn't play against Olympia. So when Forest won one of their first European Cups, it's the same time Olympia win their first Copa Libertadores, and they should have played each other in the Intercontinental Cup. But because of some previous involvement between Racing and Celtic in, I think it's 67, the British teams were at the time refusing to go to South America. So that's why Olympia ended up playing Malmo from Sweden, who were the beaten finalists. And of course, as everybody knows, Olympia won and became world champions, the only Paraguayan side to do so. But that's interesting that Forest goes right back to that kind of link to Paraguayan folklore, I suppose, because it could have been a much different result if they came up against Brian Clough's team and not Malmo. But that's for another day. Very excited to talk about this. Like we're saying, there's this player that we know very well, but kind of in England, people don't know yet because he hasn't got very many minutes. And I don't know, Roberto, if you're happy for me to jump in and bring in Paul. I was going to ask you, Paul, I guess the first question I have is, what happened to Ojeda last season, and why didn't he play at all? Because it was a very strange situation that he was eligible for Andy Reid's under 23s, but he didn't. I think he got maybe 1 or 2 games, and then he wasn't taken out on loan anywhere. He was just in training with the first team squad, but rarely in a match day team. So I don't know if you have an opinion of why he didn't get any minutes in senior football last year.
Well, Forest were never particularly a side that like to play senior players very often in the under-23 side, unless they were coming back from injury or really requested themselves to get some match minutes. There weren't very often any senior players involved in Andy Reid's side at all. It's just the way they do things over here. I wouldn't read too much into the fact that he wasn't involved in the under-23 side. It was a little bit curious. It was a little bit curious that he kind of played those 3 games in the first team towards the end of 2021, shortly after Steve Cooper had been appointed as manager, and he did okay. He didn't look remarkable. He didn't, blow anybody away, but he looked steady enough. He was neat and tidy on the ball. He looked technically a very good player. You could kind of, he was everything you would expect from a player from that part of the world, but then he just disappeared out of the picture. He was never really close to being in Steve Cooper's plans, really, and I don't get the sense that is necessarily going to change in the immediate future this season. He's got some work to do to kind of play his way into the Forest first team, I think.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask as well, as a kind of follow-up, because we've seen the big signing, I suppose, for Forest is Jesse Lingard, the kind of marquee signing, but they also picked up O'Brien as well, who plays in a similar position to Ojeda. So it looks as if Steve Cooper's kind of building the players he wants, and maybe that's putting Ojeda further down the pecking order. So what kind of expectations do you think we can have for him for this season, or is there even a chance he might be going out on loan or something?
Yeah, I think that's the most likely outcome. In fact, that's what we were briefed a few weeks ago, was that he is among a small group of players that the club would like to get out on loan, just purely to get some match minutes. I think they quite like him. They think he's a decent prospect, and he's somebody that they hope will develop and evolve into somebody that can play in the Forest first team in future. But the fact is that they're close to signing another midfielder in Onel Mangala as well. That should be announced at some point in the next 24, 48 hours. So he'll move even further down the pecking order again. And in the nicest possible way, if you're a player that's only played 3 games in the Championship last season, it's unlikely that, unless you've progressed hugely behind the scenes, that you're going to suddenly compete for a place in a Premier League side that looks drastically changed from the one we saw last season. Forest have gone out and strengthened. They've spent somewhere in excess of £80 million once Mangala gets over the line. They're still keen on Morgan Gibbs-White from Wolves as well. He's not quite the same player by any means as Ojeda, but would again add an option in that number 10 role. So he would be well down the pecking order. And while they do like him and they do think a lot of him, I think it is more likely that they'll try and get him some first team experience, and more importantly, some regular football somewhere else where he can learn his trade and perhaps learn a little bit about the physical demands of English football, because it is very different. It is very dynamic. It is very strength orientated. It is very, very physically demanding. And I think that might be something he needs to acclimatise himself to a little bit more.
Okay, it's my turn. I'll go in. Paul, let me ask my questions. I'm actually surprised to hear this from you, just because of what we've actually learned so far during this preseason. Seeing him play a couple of friendlies even. But just listening to you, so they pretty much tested him. They seen him play last season, and they pretty much haven't liked him. That's the feeling I get hearing from you. That the coach doesn't want him pretty much on the starting role, not yet. They don't see that he's a Premier League caliber player yet. So the future for him is probably not in Nottingham Forest. But for this season, do you see that becoming a reality very soon, or you think this is a situation that could probably extend itself to the beginning of the season?
I think they'll try and get him a loan move in the near future. I think they do like him. I think the key word in what you just said there is yet. They don't see him as being perhaps a Premier League player yet, but the hope is very much that he will be in future. And it's all about his development and how to get him to evolve into the kind of player they believe he can be. And to be blunt, sitting on the sidelines and watching from the stands at the City Ground every weekend is probably not the best way to do it. He needs to be going somewhere to play football. I like him. I like what I've seen of him. I can kind of see Steve Cooper's point about him not quite being ready yet. He played in the friendly against Notts County in the week, for example, and he to be blunt, wasn't particularly impressive. He was one of 3 players that were taken off at half time, and Cooper, who's not normally one to be massively critical of players, he didn't name Ojeda specifically, but there were a few senior players involved in what was generally a very young team. It wasn't the first team that played against Notts County. It was kind of a mix of players coming back from injury and a lot of young players. But he did say that the senior players were involved didn't really impress him, and I think you could probably include Ojeda in that because he hauled them off at half time. He just looked like a player who was really trying. It sounds a daft thing to say, but it looked like he was trying too hard to impress. He was really trying to be busy and get about the pitch, and he just gave away a succession of silly fouls around his own box, and you could see the manager getting a little bit riled with him on that front. So, yeah, it's all about potential. It's all about growth, and I think he is a player that can have a future at Forest, but he might have to work a little bit harder to get that opportunity in the future.
Getting this chance to talk to you, Paul. You're there. You see the practices. You know these guys' life style and just what they do every day. I love to hear from you. What is a day like for an athlete like Braian Ojeda? I know his lifestyle over here, like while he was playing here in Paraguay. But I know a lot of people probably here in this podcast would also like to know what it is like to adapt his life to a new country, to a new continent. Like it was for Braian that just left Paraguay. He went to England, and what is it day like over there? Has he been practicing with other coaches besides what he does on the training ground?
I know in terms of his life away from football, I know he's been working hard to learn English, because that was a hurdle for him to overcome early on. There were communication issues because his English wasn't brilliant to begin with. And whilst there is a hugely cosmopolitan dressing room at Forest with a lot of different nationalities in there, I think that was an issue for him early on. I believe he's made a lot of progress on that front, and he's now able to hold conversations and communicate with the rest of the players. So that will make a big difference for him. Just being able to feel part of things and be able to have a chat with the other players whilst they're preparing for training or whatever else. It's got to be difficult. It must be difficult for players when they come over to a new country, particularly one that's culturally, I imagine, pretty different. Nottingham's it's a wonderful city. It's very, there's lots of different nationalities in Nottingham as well, and it is a lovely place to live. So I'm sure he's probably quite comfortable and quite happy being here, but it's still something that you have to adapt to, and that might have taken him a little bit of time as well. I think if he is likely to go on loan anywhere, it probably will be within English football, because Forest will want him to learn about English football and learn about coping with the demands of it. Like we said earlier, I think it's unlikely that he'll go abroad anywhere, because that would kind of more or less defeat the object of him going out on loan, really.
Yeah, and Paul, I wanted to close out my questions because you talk about how Ojeda definitely needs that experience, and one of the few things that I wanted to talk about is because I think for this Forest side, I think they definitely understand the challenges of being in the Premier League. I mean, that's going to go into my next question, but for Ojeda's case, from what you've seen, from what really you feel would be the best possible way, would it be going on loan to another Premier League team? Would it even be going on loan to another championship team, that maybe one that's contending to go back to the Premier League, maybe one that's in mid-table? Or what do you feel would be the best way for him to grow into English football and to develop so that Nottingham can indeed trust him in the future?
I think, to be blunt, it's probably unlikely that another Premier League club would take him, or at least offer him what Forest want, which would be regular football. Forest themselves are a team that are just going up from the Championship, and if they haven't got a place for him in their first team, it feels unlikely that another Premier League side perhaps would. But I could certainly see him playing in the Championship. He does seem to be at that level, at least. He looks neat and tidy. He looks technically strong. He's good on the ball. He was quite good at carrying the ball and getting up and down the pitch. He's looked like he's got a lot of energy and dynamism and work rate, so he does have a lot of qualities that would suit him to playing in the Championship, or at the worst case scenario, perhaps at the top end of League One. I think the important thing is for him not to go somewhere where he'll play a peripheral role. The important thing is for him to go somewhere where he'll be a key figure, where he'll play regularly, and where he'll be a fulcrum of the side, if you like, and more or less have that opportunity to learn and grow as a player. It's not, there'd be no point in him going somewhere where he'd just sit on the bench or sit in the stands like he would do at Forest. That would be a waste of a season. So they need to find the right move for him. That's important. He needs to find a good home where he can continue to try and become the player that everyone thinks he can be.
Yeah, I totally understand. And I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens to him in the future. And just into my last question, Han, thank you again for taking your time to do this. I mean, I think for a lot of Paraguayans that obviously are big Premier League fans that are obviously going to be expectant of this Nottingham Forest side, maybe the first time that they will be seeing this Nottingham Forest side in the Premier League in their lifetime. I just want your thoughts on what do you expect from them this season? I mean, some maybe a prediction or so of how they'll do. And just, I think from an overall case, I mean, we talk about how, many Paraguayans are going to get exposed to the likes of Brighton now with Enciso. They've been very much used to Newcastle with Miguel Almiron, but just what to expect and really what makes Nottingham Forest so special, be it from the team, even the city itself, what makes Nottingham the way it is, and obviously why, maybe from a neutral perspective, if you're a Paraguayan, they should follow this team next season.
I think it's a very broad question, but I think the thing that made Forest so special last season and what won them a lot of fans, I think there's a lot of perhaps I wouldn't say neutral football fans, but there's a lot of football fans in Britain who seem to have taken a liking to Forest as their second team, if you like. They like to see Forest do well just because of the way they go about things. And Steve Cooper, the job he did last season, it's hard to overstate what a remarkable achievement it was. The Forest were at the bottom of the Championship table. They looked it's too strong to say they looked doomed. They didn't look doomed, but they looked like they were facing a season of struggle, a season of fighting against relegation rather than fighting to escape the division at the other end. For the first time, it actually felt like every previous season, almost every previous season, there was this sense of optimism that this would finally be the year, that this would be the time that they'd get out of the division. And bizarrely, after 7 games last year, I don't think anybody thought that was going to happen. I think there was everyone had just resigned themselves to a pretty bleak future and a pretty poor season. Steve Cooper's first task when he came in was to get them out of trouble. But he has, whatever happens from this point, he's secured himself hero status in this city by being the man to get them out of the division, get them into the Premier League again for the first time in 23 years. He won't have to buy a drink again in Nottingham, I don't think. But yeah, I think what you can expect from Forest is just what he demands. He demands work rate, he demands passion, he demands taking a pride in the shirt. And I think Forest will surprise a few people next season. I don't for a minute think they're going to be finishing in the top half of the table. I don't think they're going to do anything daft like they did under Brian Clough when in the first season when they were promoted, it began their story of going on to dominate Europe. We're not going to see that. It's a different world now. No team's going to go up and challenge for the title after coming up from the Championship. But I think they will upset a few people. I think they will cause a few surprises. I think there'll be teams that will come to the City Ground and be surprised at just what an intense atmosphere there is at the City Ground, because the Forest fans make it such a partisan place to come, and I think it will surprise a few teams that are perhaps not used to coming to places like the City Ground. And if they can give out a few bloody noses here and there, I think they can very much comfortably finish 16th, 15th, 14th, and hopefully establish themselves in the Premier League for another season when they can look to build and grow again in the future with a good young group of players that they seem to be putting together. Most of the signings they've made this summer have all been under the age of 26 or so. They're all players that are only going to get better and improve in the future. So if they can stay in the top flight, then they'll hopefully have a squad of players that can only improve and get stronger as time passes by. And maybe a player like Ojeda can go away, learn his trade, and come back in and be part of that group in the future.
Definitely. And I think all of us are very much expectant of this Forest side to see how they can do, to see the fact that, like you said, that passion and really making it a hard place to play in. It kind of is similar to what we usually do and cover in South America. So I think a lot of fans will definitely feel as if though they can adopt their Forest as their second team, like you said. So we'll definitely see what happens here. So I think it's a great way to close this great episode, Paul. Thank you again for coming on. So for myself, Roberto Rojas, Fede Perez, and Ralph Hanna, thank you so much for listening in. See you soon.